do to the Republicans every year I ran for re-election. In 1932, I got 23 million votes to his 16 million. A margin of 7 million votes, which is not bad even today for your candidates. After that came my first inaugural. I worked on the speech for a week, penning the first draft by myself in 4 hours. I began with these lines. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and prosper. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The speech itself took only 15 minutes. It is one of the shortest inaugural addresses on record. The reality, of course, was that the country, the people of the country, had plenty to fear in that dark time. But coming from someone who had defeated poliomyelitis, the words were comforting. I was now president, and certain features of my approach to that job stood out. First of all, I had developed an affinity for action, for addressing a problem. During the campaign, I spoke one of my more memorable lines. The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands, bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. By the way, that approach, combined with my lack of ideological rigidity, brought out the old shallowness argument again. But this was actually the best way to fight the Depression. The fact was, the situation was unprecedented. Nobody knew for sure what to do. Experimentation delivered boldly really was the best way to come up with a solution. I also did have a philosophy. Critics have made comments on how I have no guiding light, but that is not true. There's a wonderful story about this. Early on in my first administration, a callow young reporter came to interview me. And he burst out, he asked me, Mr. President, he said, are you a communist? And I laughed and said, no, of course not. And then he asked me, he said, are you a socialist? And I said, no. And he went through all the isms. He wound up asking me if I was a fascist, and I said, of course not. Well, the young man was quite perturbed by that point in time. And he blurted out the one question I wasn't ready for. He said, well, what are you? And I had to think about that for a second. And I responded, why? I'm a Democrat and a Christian. Now let me explain what these terms mean, or at least what I meant back then. Democrat is capital D. I am the head of my party. By Christian, I meant basic beliefs, a basic sense of faith. Things like that the poor should be assisted, that hunger is not acceptable, that the strong should not allow the weak to be preyed upon. But even more than that, I had developed a new approach to government. The best way I can explain it is this. After the New Deal, the federal government bears some responsibility for the welfare of the American people. Nothing has ever changed that. How large a commitment that is varies, of course, from year to year, administration to administration. But it has always been there since 1933 to some degree or another. I think of it as being on a scale. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's very little. The scale was created by my administration. In other words, the government is now an expression of the American community. Let me give you an example of how real this change truly is. Hurricane Katrina hit quite recently, a majority, not all of by any means, but most of Americans criticized the federal government for not only incompetence, but a failure to act, a failure to respond. Yet, in 1927, the Mississippi River experienced a terrible flood, wiping out the regions along its banks, a disaster in the same area and in the same magnitude as what struck roughly 80 years later. But in the 1920s, before my New Deal, nobody expected federal help. The Army actually charged the Red Cross for the blankets and field kitchens that they borrowed, and nobody found fault with that action. Back then they did. Now that would be inconceivable. That is how much I have changed